Hello, good evening and welcome. This evening I am delighted to be joined in Kinloss. Yes, this is the very first time we're running an event that is live in Kinloss with the remarkable and highly experienced journalist Hella Pick. Hella has lived through and commented on just about every story that was important while I was growing up, but her story begins long before that. Hella came over to England. She was born in Austria. She came over to England with the Kindertransport and spent time fostered out to a family, was at a boarding school, then studied at the LSE, came into journalism, went off to Africa, was in America, was in Selma with Martin Luther King, reported on the Kennedy assassination, moved to Eastern Europe and met with Gorbachev on board a battleship. This is a remarkable story. And then she went on to be the official biographer of Simon Wiesenthal. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm looking forward to drawing from Hella some of her remarkable experiences and insights. And I'm not on any commission for this, but I really would commend to everyone her book, Invisible Walls. I have the hard copy. I also listened to it on audiobook because Hella has a beautiful voice and cadence, which you will be privileged to hear in just a moment. And she is reading the audiobook. The book has been substantially written during the last year of COVID and lockdown. And so it is incredibly current. Jumping back, first of all, hello, Hella, and welcome.
Well, thank you. Who could have a better introduction? I feel there's nothing left to say.
There's plenty to go through. So, growing up in Austria, what are your early memories before the war?
Well, unfortunately, I have to say that my memories of my Viennese existence are very, very small indeed. I was only 8 years old when I left, and I remember just little scraps of my existence then. My mother managed to rescue a birthday book that I kept as a child, and in it has messages from all my school friends, how we swore to each other, to love each other forever and ever, and always remain friends. So I have that, and from the names, I can recognize that 2 or 3 of my schoolmates were Jewish. Also that there was a Jewish teacher who wrote into that book with a kind of warning. It must have been written in 1937, I would guess, who just wrote a message in which he really tried to suggest that life would not go on as comfortably as I was experiencing it then, that the storm clouds were gathering. But I really remember very, very little before of my life. I should have said that, I do remember that my parents were divorced, and I was living with my mother, and we had moved into the center of Vienna. We'd lived in the outskirts. After 1938, we moved into Vienna because it was thought it would be safer. And nevertheless, I was one evening, it was the awful knock on the door, and the Gestapo was at the door and took away my mother. I was left with a friend of hers who fortunately was in the flat. But my mother, after a few hours, returned. Didn't say much about what had happened. And this happened the second time. And again, she was fortunate enough to come back. But at that point, I think my mother decided that she had to get me out and send me out to safety, and managed to arranged for me to be put onto the Kindertransport. And I would just, as a sort of footnote to this, which might be interesting to the congregation here, quite a few years later, when I had embarked on my journalism and was in Nigeria for the independence celebrations of that country, one of the people I met there was a senior Israeli diplomat, Ehud Ariel. And it turned out that Ehud had worked for the Youth Aliyah in Vienna in 1938 and 39, and had actually worked on the Kindertransport arrangements. So in a way, we both decided that I owed him my life, and we became lifelong friends after that.
So you come into England, and you're probably too young at the time to understand that you owed people your life. But what did it feel like to come into this country in 1938 as a refugee?
Well, you know, the Kindertransport children were made very welcome. So, and in most cases, it was individual families, mostly Jewish families, but also the Quakers have been very active in promoting the Kindertransport scheme and supporting it, and quite a lot of children ended up in Quaker families. I was adopted, so to speak. My foster parents lived in London, in Bromsbury, as it happened, and they were Jewish, secular Jews. They were lawyers and business people, and they had 3 children. All of them slightly, the oldest one was already 16 or 17, and a pair of twins who were closer to my age. And they came to me, and they spoke German, and they had a German maid. So I did have somewhat, because I knew no English at all. The only phrase I knew was goodbye when I arrived, which was not very helpful. I was put to school very quickly, and obviously acquired English with great speed, because by the end of my first term there, which was in the spring of 1939, I came home with a good report. And that I was obviously able to learn and to participate in the school activities. And children just acquire languages very quickly, and I must have absorbed it almost instantaneously.
And how accepted were you by the non-Jewish kids around you in the school?
I think, I have my memories really start from the moment when I started going to school, when I went to the Lake District. Sorry, that's another story. But anyway, I spent that first term in London. I remember much more about my family and the children to whom I became very close, and who were extraordinarily kind, showed me London and everything. But then I was really amongst the very lucky Kindertransport children, because my mother managed to get a visa to come to England as well. And
right, but she was unable to join you in a family.
Not immediately, yes, because, women refugees England was actually encouraging the women refugees to come because they needed domestic help. And the women, like my mother, who came on their own, and of course having lost all their possessions, because you could only get an exit permit from Austria if you had given away all your possessions and left everything behind. So they were gradually penniless, and the only work that she was allowed to do was domestic work. And she became a cook in a family in Surrey, who really treated her as a servant. I mean, this was a real upstairs-downstairs situation. And there was no way that they would have me live with her. And so I remained in London with my adopted family, and my mother on her off days would come to London and we would see each other, and then she would go back to her job as a cook.
What had her previous job been in Austria?
She just lived, during her marriage, she never had a profession.
Right.
The only thing is, she came from a comfortable middle-class background and lived sort of just amongst her friends. And
so this is really a
so
fallen bourgeoisie situation.
Fortunately, she had friends who had a big milliner salon in Vienna, and she loved working with her hands. And she decided she wanted to learn how hats were made and also work with leather gloves and so on. And she enjoyed that, and that came to her help after the war, because then she could stop being a cook and she could earn her living as a milliner in London. So that was very. The other thing, of course, my mother went to cooking, a household school. She didn't go to university. And I still have a handwritten cookery book with all the recipes that she learned, and some of them I use. That book is now in a rather tattered condition and needs somebody to completely rework that book and make it look respectable again.
So you completed your education, and how did you end up becoming a journalist?
That was pure accident. You mentioned I went to school. Sorry, I should just say, my mother changed her job, became a cook to a family who happened to have a home in London, but also a house in the English Lake District. And my mother and I ended up in the Lake District. She had to work as a cook throughout the war, but I was able to live with her, and I went to a private school, which was essentially a boarding school for girls, but they had a few day pupils, and I was one of the day pupils. And while I was at that school, my foster parents wanted me to stop schooling at 16 and take a secretarial course and start earning my living. I refused. I said, I want to stay on at school. The school wanted me to stay on because I was obviously a good student, and they enabled me to stay until I matriculated, as it was called in those days anyway, and then got a place at the London School of Economics. When I finished there, I was still not quite certain what I really wanted to do. For a time, I worked as a research assistant for one of my LSE professors. Then I got a job with an organization called the Colonial Development Corporation, and did market research there, which sort of taught me a certain amount about Africa, which was then useful, which came in very usefully afterwards. But I realized I didn't really enjoy doing 9 to 5, a job 9 to 5. I wanted something that had greater flexibility attached to it. And I started looking around, and one day answered an advertisement in the Statesman for a commercial editor of a weekly paper published in London called West Africa. And I got the job, and that is how I became a journalist. It was not that I planned to be a journalist. It was not like so many young people today think that a career in media is the most wonderful thing in the world. I literally fell into it by accident. But of course, I've never regretted it.
And this was a job that took you into Africa.
That's right. The West Africa, this magazine, at the time belonged to the Daily Mirror, and they also had daily papers in what was still then the 4 British West African colonies, who were all in the process of negotiating their independence. And I I would not be expected just simply to write about trade and economic affairs in West Africa, but to start writing about the constitutional changes that were going on, not just in British West Africa.
Hello, people. Can you hear us again? Are we back? Wave, please. Thank you. Oh, we just lost
lost it again.
No, the internet dropped out here in short. Okay. So, a young woman. What was it like to be a young woman in that kind of environment? Who were you mixing with, and what was the Africa that you were in?
Well, it was a very exciting place. I was working together with a small group. Sorry. There were very few European journalists writing about those constitutional changes in West Africa. And I suddenly found myself the only woman with virtually a group of very experienced European journalists, partly British, partly French, and one or two Italians. And at first, they didn't take me seriously. You know, who was this young woman doing? Why is she here? But when they realized that, you know, I wasn't entirely stupid and that I was following the events very closely, they sort of let me join the club, which was nice. It made me feel important and wanted and also useful. And also, you know, security in those days was not really a very familiar word. And we had access to all the interesting African leaders who were in the process of negotiating with their governments, either in London or in Paris. And and of course, because I was a woman, first of all, they were interested. And also, it's much easier to remember a woman amongst a lot of men than the men. So I soon became friends with a lot of people that, you know, today you would not expect to meet. And I think I was just busy learning how to be a good journalist, learning what it takes to win the trust of the people that you're talking with and whom you're trying to interview. And also, you know, it was very thrilling to be following this transition from colonialism to independence. Today, when we talk about the black movements, people forget what it was like in those days, because the African leaders I was meeting were less concerned with slavery and with their past. They were planning for the future. And so I was, in a way, beginning to think about my own future as well. And I was developing in my thinking, in my feelings, and learning a lot.
So just as you were thinking about your future, what part, if any, did your Judaism play? How conscious were you of that as part of your heritage?
Look, I was conscious of it, but the fear of anti-Semitism was so inbred in me that I found it virtually impossible to acknowledge the fact that I was Jewish. I mean, I will go back just for a few seconds to the time in the Lake District. If my mother ever spoke a word of German in any public space, I would scream at her. The thing is, I was really, at that stage, still in hiding and fearful of coming out of hiding. And, you know, I refer to that in my book. It took me really decades until I felt really, really comfortable in my Jewish culture, in being having a public Jewish faith.
So your book is called Invisible Walls, a journalist in search of her life. What were the invisible walls?
Well, I think those walls were trying to break out of hiding in a way. You know, they were the insecure. I'm firmly convinced that a refugee never quite loses a sense of insecurity. You've lost your roots. If you're sufficiently firmly grounded in Judaism, perhaps that identity is enough to help you escape this idea of having been uprooted from your culture. I come from at least on my mother's side, from a secular background. My mother always said that her marriage broke up because on my father's side, it was a very traditional conservative family, and she was unable to live the life that was expected from her in-laws. My father was secular, but the family behind him were not. But to my shame, I never really explored that with her deeply enough. Just what it was that had alienated her to the extent that it was evident, and which she somehow inculcated in my early education. But I really do think it was because I didn't have that kind of background that I found it much harder to deal with the whole issue of being uprooted. But I started learning all those lessons much, much later in life.
So what was it that triggered a sense of Jewish identity later and helped to reconcile you a little?
Well, partly because, even if I say that the insecurity remained, I was more secure than I felt more secure in myself after all. But I think it was partly because before I wrote this book, Invisible Walls, I wrote a biography of Simon Wiesenthal, known as one of the Nazi-Hunters, and he was still alive, and I spent a great deal of time with him and he lived in Vienna. But talking with him, thinking much more deeply about the Holocaust and its consequences and its roots, and thinking, being much closer to all those issues, of course, brought out in me a great deal more thinking about my own self and my own Jewishness and my own Jewish culture, and also, realizing how much I'd missed by not having been taught and learned much more about Jewish culture. And, catching up is difficult. But, it's just that the Jewish identity in me took a long time to come to the forefront. But I did it partly through my work with Simon Wiesenthal, and then because after that I'd stopped working for The Guardian and went to work with George Weidenfeld, the publisher, who himself, like me, was a secular Jew, but very, very conscious of his Jewish heritage.
Also from Austria.
And also from Austria, but with his deepest loyalty now to Israel, and also someone who was a really hard-hitting fighter of anti-Semitism. All of that put together, changed. So about changes in me.
I want to go back in time just a little bit, but while we're dealing with the refugee identity thing, what do you think? There's a lot of movement of people around the world at the moment, some for economic reasons, some for persecution. Refugees are very much in the forefront of political discussion. What message would you give Jewish communities here? And what message would you give our governments about what we should be doing to reach out to refugees and to acclimatize refugees?
I think one has to reach out to refugees. I get quite angry when I see refugees of my origin criticizing or trying to stem the inflow of refugees today. I do not think that we have a right to do that. okay, we may come from different backgrounds, we may find it easier to acclimatize in this country, but it does not justify saying we must keep out these new people. I realize there's a limit to the number of people that you can take in as migrants, but I certainly think that Jews, it is not their business to try and prevent people from coming to stand with our dreadful Home Secretary and support her view of how to deal with migrants. I feel very strongly about that. I mean, I think refugees have to recognize that nobody really wants to flee their own country unless there's some good reason for it.
You were in Selma, Alabama, when Martin Luther King began his march to Washington. Another very important civil rights story. What was it that took you to America? Let's just get there very quickly. But what was it like to be in America at that time?
Well, what took me to America was the fact that I'd started to work for The Guardian. The Guardian made me first their UN correspondent and eventually Washington correspondent. To be in America at a time when the whole issue of voting rights for American Africans had finally become real, and change was in the offing. It was great. It was wonderful to be there to witness this, but of course it was tough, and what I find very sad is, having finally got their voting rights, at the present time, a lot of the states in America, again, trying to cut back on the voting rights for African Americans. And, I think it was at the time to be in Selma, to watch the enthusiasm of the march and listen to Martin Luther King. You really felt that change was finally coming to the South in America.
And you put your life strangely at risk on that day.
Yes, because I was ignorant. At least I hadn't realized how dangerous it could be. I had a car during the march. Part of the time I was actually marching along with the march, but we always then went back and anyway, I had a car, and I gave a lift to one of the black American journalists, a man, and that potentially was an invitation to the Ku Klux Klan to shoot me. I discovered a day after I'd done that a white woman who'd given a lift to some of the demonstrators, some of the black American demonstrators, was shot and killed, and it could just as well have happened to me. But fortunately, I didn't even realize that I was risking my life.
So in America, working for The Guardian, you were under the wing of somebody who was one of my great heroes growing up, and that was the late and great Alistair Cook. For people of my generation, Alistair Cook was a commentator in America. For people around today, Alistair Cook is an English cricketer, and they are two different Alistair Cooks. But tell me about the young Alistair Cook.
Well, he was already a mature Alistair Cook.
He was a mature Alistair Cook then.
He was wonderful. I mean, I always felt that he was my true mentor in terms of really teaching me how to be a good journalist. But he was a lovely man to know, and I had the great privilege that, because he always wrote that letter of America in the middle of the week, and he recorded it on Fridays, but on Wednesday evenings, if I was in New York and I would go to see him for a drink around 6 o'clock in the evening, and he would read out to me the letter from America that he had just drafted. And so I got a sort of little dress rehearsal of that broadcast. And then, as it happened, the producer of the letter from America later became the wife of one of my very close friends. And she, because I never went to the studio, but she told me in the studio, he was always absolutely word perfect, always had written just to the right length. He never overran, they never had to cut anything. And, and his delivery was always, the thing about his letters was, if you followed them, it started off in one place and it would end up somewhere quite different. And he'd strung it all together into a wonderful tale. But he also taught me the most important thing for a journalist. He always said, if you're writing an article, if you don't, in your first paragraph, tell your readers what all this is about, you've lost them. So it's a very good lesson that you have to be able to demonstrate what you're about to write about.
Clearly, rabbis delivering sermons need schooling in this. Right? It's all right to move from one place to another, but at least tell them where you're going at the beginning.
Exactly.
So what were the other skills that he or insights into journalism that he imparted?
Well, that nothing comes easy. That you really have to work at it. You don't just sit down and write it. You have to talk to people, you have to read a lot, you have to follow things, and you've got to have good political antennae. And of course, he had incredible writing skills. I mean, his descriptions of events, I think, were quite unique.
So, political antennae are one thing. How did you find being a woman in journalism in America at a time when at the end of receptions, women left the room to leave the man to discuss business?
Well, that was only in British embassies. Don't forget that, the women's movement feminism was extremely active during my time there. And, I met people like Gloria Steinem and so on. So, I was familiar with what was going on. For me, I'm not much of an organization person, so I didn't join the movement per se. I've worked more by example, if you like. But I found, and I think, most women journalists of that, certainly of that period, because there were so few of us, would tell you the same thing, that, if we were any good at all, we stood out because there were so few of us, so people, remembered us more easily. Because I mentioned this was happening in Africa, but of course it happened just the same in America. Amongst a group of male journalists, if you have 2 or 3 women in that group, on the whole, people will tend to remember you more easily, unless you're doing something particularly foolish. But of course, it had its hazards and its challenges as well. And there were times when you felt very excluded because you were a woman. And, the only real sort of help then was that, women helped each other. I mean, for instance, when I was the United Nations correspondent for The Guardian, there were 2 or 3 other very good women journalists working, also based in the UN building, and we helped each other a lot. We gave each other our insights, and even though we were all competing against each other, we were also cooperating, and the women always did. We were very collegial.
You interviewed a large number of world leaders and significant characters. You met Kennedy, interviewed Tito, Ceausescu. Who is the most impressive leader that you met and interviewed in 92 years of meeting people?
Everybody asks me this question. It's difficult to give them, because each in his own way was interesting. It really depends on the environment, the setting. I mean, I could tell you about one person that I would immediately exclude from this group is Ceausescu, the president of Romania, who was one of the most awful people and the worst liar, I think, that I've ever met. But anyway, but I think amongst the leaders that would have impressed me most, when you mentioned Gorbachev, certainly Kennedy. I always include Willie Brown in my life as a special person, because he really helped me to come to terms with Germany in a way that nobody else did. Just to be sort of, I will have Gorbachev, I will have Willie Brown, I will have Kennedy, I would have I never actually met him, I just saw him from a distance, President Johnson, because I think he really did more for the Black African community in terms of giving them the voting rights, getting that through the Congress, the voting rights bill, really was a crucial event in the development of the relationship. So I would certainly include him. But, there were so many others. I mean, Tito, to me, was a very impressive figure, very flawed, but then, most leaders are flawed. But there were so many others that, under particular circumstances, would seem important and impressive. But, on the whole, you don't get to top positions if there's not something important about you. And sadly, so often it can be something very bad, but when it's positive.
So one of the very enigmatic leaders was Kurt Waldheim. There are a number of W's. You've Rabbi Lawrence, Willy Brandt, Waldheim, Wiesenthal, and Weidenfeld. Lots of W's in your life. But Kurt Waldheim,
yes.
Chancellor in Austria, President of the United Nations, Secretary General of the United Nations. Nazi past comes to light. What was your take on him?
Look, I never thought that he was an important Nazi war criminal in the sense that he actually initiated the events with which he's always been associated. To me, he's always been a complete mystery, because I never understood how he got to the high positions that he reached, because he was essentially a weak person, unimaginative, no leadership qualities that I ever discerned. I think he was sadly, in terms of the Holocaust, and he was one of those people who followed orders. I don't think he ever himself would have initiated the actions with which he's associated. And, interestingly enough, Wiesenthal shared that view. And of course, that led to a lot of conflict with a great many Jewish leaders. But Waldheim, there's that awful phrase, to be a bootlicker, and I think essentially that's what he was. George Weidenfeld always refused to condemn him for a very personal reason, which was that when they were both students at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, just in 1938, Jews were no longer allowed to attend lectures, and Waldheim brought George Weidenfeld all the relevant papers and lecture notes and so on, which enabled George Weidenfeld to stand for the exams at the end of the term without actually being able to attend the lectures in the school. And so George Weidenfeld always thought he owed him something. But he also shared, we both shared the same view that essentially Waldheim was just a weakling, not a perpetrator in the sense in which the World Jewish Congress always portrayed him.
In those days, the United Nations was considered important. I mean, when you were a journalist there, did you think the United Nations was important?
When I was there, yes, it was, because at that time it really was one of the key diplomatic theaters of the Cold War. And that is where senior diplomats and very often the leaders themselves met and to some extent negotiated, certainly exchanged verbal warfare, but it was very much an important center of the Cold War. And at the same time, it was the place where the new emerging countries of Africa were beginning to play a role on the international scene. And so, at the same time, the United Nations was also trying to negotiate over the war in the Congo, over the independence of Rhodesia, over apartheid in South Africa. All of those issues were being played out and debated and to a degree negotiated within the confines of the United Nations. So for a journalist, it was a great place to be in. You know, today it's unimaginable that major news organizations would keep senior correspondents posted at the United Nations. In my time, we were really serious bunch of journalists covering the UN. And I mean, I would have stories in the paper day after day after day. So, no, it was very, very different. But
do you think it matters at all today?
Yes, I think it still matters. I think the Security Council, for all its inability to reach important decisions, still matters. And there is the UN development work. The UN is now, will, I think, continue to play an important role in environmental issues. There are so many issues that go way beyond the nation state and way beyond the regional organizations, and where the UN can still play a role. And then don't forget UN agencies like the High Commission for Refugees. All those bodies are still doing useful work, and they certainly need to be supported.
Willie Brown, how did he change your views?
Just by talking with me, talking about his views, his morals, his ethics, his view of the world.
So what was his background?
His background is pretty well known, but he himself was a refugee during the war and came back. But the important thing about Willie Brown is that he understood the key aspects of contemporary German history, he understood the need to teach Germans to understand just how deeply involved they had been in the Holocaust and how they had to relive that experience, had to understand the fundamental change, not just in the political system, but above all in their morals, in their ethics, had to be taught in the schools and had to be driven home to every single German citizen. And I think he also taught by example.
So to face up to their past.
Yeah, obviously to face up to the past, but not just to face up to it, but to learn the lessons of the past and to understand that this is something that must not be repeated. And I know that the far right has still not been stamped out in Germany, but at least they now have the legislation in place. They have the educational instruments in place to try and really do their best to keep the far right to a minority which cannot damage the body politic of Germany too.
Invite anybody who's got any questions, please, to type them into the chat on the Zoom. You talked about Germany facing up to its past, and one of the things when I've been on tours or spoken with people, they say that Germany actually has done that, but Austria has not. People feel uneasy going back to Austria. You've actually been back to Austria, and you see yourself, a lover of its vibrancy and its culture. It feels a little bit like home to you. What do you say to those people who say Austria never addressed its past?
Well, I think to some extent you're right. In Germany, Holocaust teaching has become a hugely important element of education. In Austria, Holocaust teaching does happen, probably not with as much emphasis as in Germany. But I think, in a way, I can't justify the fact that I feel comfortable in Austria, but I do. Look, if you ask me whether I have personally experienced anti-Semitism as an adult in Austria, my answer would be really no. I hate that phrase, I have many friends in Austria, but other people say I have many Jewish friends. But the fact is, I have made friends with quite a large number of Austrians that I've come to know, partly because Austria was part of my parish for a time. I was reporting on Austrian politics. The Guardian used to have sort of special editions of various countries of Europe, and Austria was always one of them. And I spent a lot of time writing articles about the economics and culture of Austria and so on. But the fact is, Austria is a place where a lot of people feel very comfortable. It's an easy life in Austria. It's a small country, which helps. And I really just feel at home. I can't say I feel at home, but I don't quite feel a tourist either when I'm in Austria. I'm always happy to be there. Partly, Vienna is a cultural city. I love going to the opera. I love going to concerts. It's all small, and you have access to it, which is lovely. And in the summer, I have most years spent in a part of Austria in the mountains on lakes, where I have a few friends. Some are Jewish. I even have some Jewish friends who went back to Austria to live in Austria quite soon after the war, and who have holiday homes in that area. And so, it's just an easy, comfortable place to be in. But, you can say there's no logic to saying it took me longer to reconcile myself to Germany than to Austria. But then, I still see Germany as the prime source of the prime initiator of the Holocaust, rather than, even though Hitler was in Vienna. So, there's no logic to this. You won't appreciate this.
A couple of years ago, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party here, people were talking about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and a growth of anti-Semitism that made them fear that this was as bad as it had been since the 30s. For somebody like me, I've got just no way of understanding that. I hear stories, but you can talk about.
No, I can't, because I don't. I also think this is. I can't. This fearfulness. I can't share it.
You don't think it was there?
No. Of course, no doubt about anti-Semitic elements in the Labour Party. it's tied into support for Palestine, and it's tied into Israel, and I think it is something that has to be fought, and I quite agree that the Labour Party is much too slow in taking action against it. But I don't think it was a serious menace to Jews in this country. I mean, first of all, the chances of Corbyn ever winning an election were far too small to be fearful of that.
Well, we made that mistake in the 30s as well.
Yeah, but it's not. I don't think this is not the situation of the 30s.
Right. So on the other side, what we do have is a resurgence of nationalist, populist leaders and strong identity politics. Do you see that some of our leaders today are taking us into a dangerous direction?
Yes, I do. I think all this flag waving is potentially dangerous. I'm also very surprised that the Labour Party suddenly seems to think that if you put all the emphasis on Britain and buy British, that is a sensible way either of winning elections, or it's a very healthy attitude to take. And we're living in a very interdependent world, and I think this narrow focus on patriotism, there's such a narrow divide between patriotism and nationalism and extremism. It's how to separate those three and just keep the healthy part of being proud of your citizenship and your country without having this kind of excessive patriotism, nationalism attached to it. I mean, that's where I think, that you get this sort of concept of exclusiveness, which is one of the root causes of antisemitism.
Invisible Walls, a journalist in search of her life. Did you find your life?
Maybe about 70%.
And if you had to tell your 10-year-old refugee self what lessons should guide her, what would those be?
Well, to develop a character that allows you to be more secure. No, I'm not answering this very well. Well, I think to treasure what you have, to try and understand where you came from, and to try and define your identities, because I think we all have more than one identity, in a more sensible, more logical way, and also to try and create a sort of hierarchy of identities and to know which are the ones that really matter to you and which guide you. And
I think it's a very powerful message. I think a lot of people who are growing up today to treasure what you have, to know where you came from, to have something to stand for, and to be able to hierarchy.
Well, I'm sorry
to
be so boring.
Not at all. If we're looking for school mottos or something like that, I think it's really great. Ethics of the Fathers has some similar teachings. It's fundamentally Jewish, which is great.
Is there anything you would change now that something that you didn't do, or something that you did do that you would prefer not to have done?
Oh, I would change so much that I really want to start all over again.
Well, I hope you have used to it, please God.
Ad Neva Esrim Shana. So, Hella, thank you so much.
Nobody wants to ask.
Right. We've talked our way through the book and covered everything. So Hella, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And let me recommend to people who haven't yet had the opportunity to get it, her book Invisible Walls, A Journalist in Search of Her Life. I didn't want to talk through all of the fascinating anecdotes because otherwise there'd be no point in you reading it. But please do, and please do enjoy her rich insights and contribution to the world of journalism. Hella, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We wish you ongoing strength and good health, and may you continue to inspire us with your vision. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you very much indeed for tolerating me and asking such interesting questions and challenging me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.